thanks so much for coming again, filling the room. This is great. And hopefully we'll have more exciting and meaningful discussions about the questions of knowledge production, epistemology, to continue from last week. I think it's fascinating to have Ndumiso here today. To introduce him, I thought he was already had his PhD, but he's still busy. He's a lecturer at UNISA in the philosophy department. And he's basically speaking to us from a particular, from what is called Azanian philosophical tradition, which, to butcher as an introduction, I see it as bringing together philosophical concerns with a serious consideration of history as well as ethics. Fields which are in some senses often considered separate fields of activity or thought. So the way I see it, stemming from the Black consciousness movement, Black consciousness thought, and developing these ideas further and thinking about how the humanities, the social sciences, and even actually South African society can move forward in a meaningful way. So welcome. So without doing more injustice to your talk, thank you very much for coming. And you have about 45 to 50 minutes, after which we can open it up for questions. I'll give you a signal with my hand, maybe when you have 5 minutes left.
Okay.
I'll be sitting in front. Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So, open door policy. Okay. I'm hoping that I won't use all of the minutes which I've been accorded. I must first begin with a disclaimer regarding the abstract which is before you. You can consider it a kind of empty sketch which I'll color in a pretty unsystematic way. By the end, I hope the picture will be more vivid, but it is rather an empty sketch rather than a map, you know. So bear with me that the ground will be covered, but in a rather unorthodox fashion. So the first promise of the abstract is for me to give a basic introduction to the assumptions of the tradition which we work on the basis of. I think perhaps part biographical introduction should be that I think come in, find a place. Okay. All right. Are there more people? Yeah, I've kind of got, I don't work too much from the papers. As a result of that, my concentration breaking can be a serious problem for the picture that we're trying to color in. So I might scribble out the lines if it happens that there are some. Are you going to stand? You'll find a place, we'll continue. All right. So, basically, I mean, I come here really as a member of a broader community of other theoreticians working mostly out of Pretoria, Johannesburg. Our collective consists of people who are both philosophy professors and law professors, as well as so organic intellectuals who come out of the Azanian tradition, who for one reason or another didn't pursue the line of full-time academic work, but operate in communities around the province where we operate. So we've basically, through this collaboration between all of us, been exploring various aspects with the purpose of really entering into an interpretation of South Africa. This has meant an examination of the law and history as part of and parcel of the process of our examination. So in any case, those who will be at our reading group session later will notice that are there more? Oh, okay. I think are they rushing or are they? I see. Hola, sure. Hola. Eta. Hola. I know. Okay, all right. I think we are almost complete now. Yeah, so as I'm saying, you know, if you examine the work, you know, I use we and not I, because, you know, even though I take responsibility for particular articulations, we're involved in a collective process, an interdisciplinary and collective process in the disclosure of some of the problems. One of the insights which comes out of the Black consciousness tradition is the injunction to think for oneself, arising, you know, inheriting a mode of analysis which arises out of one's own historical situation. If you examine some of the major figures of the Azanian tradition, whether it be Lembede, Jordan Gubane, there's a repetition of this intellectual sovereignty, the idea that the solution and ability to think through these problems must very much rely on the resources of the people themselves whose problem it is. If you look at someone like Mangaliso Sobukwe, who was an academic linguist and African studies scholar at the University of Wits, you know, he had turned his attention to linguistics and the interpretation of Xhosa riddles. There's interesting parallels with some of the things that are happening in other parts of the continent under the derogation ethno-philosophy, for instance, at that particular point in time. So the resources which we draw from are quite disparate and include the actual activities and ethical examples of people engaged in the struggle. So, you know, there's an idea coming out of someone like the Eritrean philosopher Tsene Serekeperhan that the struggle for liberation itself ought to be understood as a text, as a resource that provides us with sets of examples of how the struggle is engaged. Of course, the struggle itself produces documents like pamphlets, speeches, which articulate strategy, tactics, and modes of interpretation, but the actual engagement in this historical combat itself provides us with sources which could be studied and used and improvised in exactly the same engagement. So I understand this as really an extension of that struggle. The work that we are trying to do is taking up questions which arise out of a historical situation of combat. I will try to elaborate this with the focus of the problem of apartheid. So returning back to our sketch, I will provide a more systematic introduction to the Azanian approach. Okay? First, I need to make the point that in the poster which appeared before you, the first point which I aim to elaborate was the emphasis upon apartheid in South African historical thinking as a result of the whiteness of academic historiography. In the paper which I had sent my abstract on, that whiteness had a footnote which didn't appear on the final poster. The footnote reads as follows. I think it's important before I begin. To be sure, according to our understanding, whiteness is already at once white supremacy. This is since whiteness is a political category historically established through the racial subjugation of other human beings on the basis that their humanity is defective in relation to that of whites. Whites, whiteness, and white supremacy are an indivisible whole, incompatible with complete human liberation and racial justice. Okay? So when I say whiteness, it makes me uncomfortable because it has a euphemistic tone of actually abstracting away from the general problem. So these things are indissoluble. People speak about, I'm talking about whiteness but not whites. This is not sensible. There are no whites without whiteness and no whiteness without whites. And more importantly, there are neither of these things without white supremacy. A political and economic system of domination, which is hierarchic and breaks human beings and divides them into into orders of quality of humanity. This system operates together. Whites are just the historical beneficiaries of this system, but this is the same thing. So I could have written white supremacy. It would have been a more accurate rendition of what it is that I'm intending to describe. Okay. There are many debates concerning the etymology of Azania and its precise meaning. There is a recent study, a thesis on Azanism, which was produced, I think, at the University of London about 3 years ago, which is an extensive elaboration. I'll be happy to make this available to you, but I won't be focusing on this right now. Our discussion here will be limited to its life as a political and philosophical term in South African history. Azania is the name that was introduced to the South African political lexicon by the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, formed in 1959 by proponents of an Africanist tendency within the African National Congress. In the PAC's postulation, Azania is the true name of the territory that has been called South Africa since the South Africa Act of 1909 of British Parliament, which established the Union of South Africa in 1910. This political event concluded the Anglo-Boer or South African War, a war between two European invading communities over the title to territory and sovereignty over territory they had wrestled from the indigenous people after conquering them. These constitutional origins of South Africa reveal that it has its basis on the loss of title to territory and sovereignty over it by the indigenous peoples conquered in the unjust wars of colonization. One clear example of the formal continuity between present-day constitutional South Africa and its 1910 predecessor are the various names of the provinces and cities in present-day South Africa. More often than not, when they are not simply the retention of the names given to political territory by the conqueror, these are the indigenous language translations or indigenous name versions of the commodities that are of value within the conqueror's economy, often at the historical expense of the indigenous people. They do not reflect the historical significance of those areas to the indigenous peoples conquered in the unjust wars of colonization. Names such as the Northern, Eastern, and Western Cape, from the division of the Cape Colony in the Union Constitution. Cities including George, King William's Town, East London, Queenstown, named after British monarchs. The so-called Free State province from the old Boer Republic of the Orania Vrystaat. eMalahleni, where coal is found, eGoli, where gold is found, eMpumalanga, East, in the Nguni languages from the Eastern Transvaal, are names that do not reflect the historical, political, and cultural significance of these places in the history of their historical inhabitants. In the PAC's understanding, it was necessary, if title to territory and sovereignty over it were sought, that South Africa itself be repudiated, even epistemologically. Azania was understood as the end to which this repudiation was directed. It was a signifier of the will towards a full and unencumbered political restoration, a restoration of political as well as epistemological sovereignty. It was more than just another name of a country to be employed once the indigenous people had succeeded their conquerors in title to territory. Azania was to be a wholly African polity rather than the old colonial vision of a little Europe in Africa. It was to be a different idea of nationhood, law, justice, national cultures, values, and democracy. Azania may be understood as the ends to which Africanist ideology and liberation philosophy were aimed. It is necessary, therefore, to discuss some basic tenets of the Africanist understanding and approach to the struggle for liberation. Amongst the most important features for our discussion here are the following. 1. The insistence by Azanians that the objective of the liberation struggle was the recovery of sovereign title to territory rather than the mere attainment of civil and political rights. 2. The insistence that the title to territory itself belongs exclusively to the indigenous people conquered in the unjust wars of colonization. 3. The rejection of multiracialism. This includes the incredulity to the tenability of non-racialism as a means and upholding it only as an end, achievable only once the title to territory had been restored to the indigenous conquered people. 4. The recognition of South Africa as a polity and idea inextricably bound to the will of the conqueror and requiring state succession by a liberated polity with a restored relationship and continuity with the African continent. This is against the political history of South Africa, having been constructed in its identity as distinctly European and bearing no cultural resemblance and relationship to the rest of the continent. Yesterday I heard a patron at a restaurant boasting to some German who was sitting on the table as I was typing away this thing, saying, telling him that this is the European quarter. You'll notice that this is not like the rest of this place. So I'm not talking about a fiction. It's a day-to-day occurrence. This is just an elaboration. It's not unheard of in South Africa to refer to visiting another African country as having been in Africa, or to refer to Africans from beyond the Limpopo as Africans in order to differentiate them from South Africans, okay? Even of the indigenous variety. Other dimensions of this schizophrenia include the continued use of terms such as African restaurants, African attire, to refer to cuisine and the fashion of the indigenous conquered people. The specification is of course a marker of alterity, distinguishing whatever is being specified from the South African variety. The point is that if you are in China, Chinese food is simply food. It is food. It is the food of the other which must be specified as Italian food, as German food, but Chinese food is food. But in South Africa, the food of the people of the land is called African food in order to specify that it differs from the norm, which is something other than African. This is the only point that I'm making, to show the consistency of this alterity. It permeates the very language and imagination of the people who stay here. Even progressive people use this language because it's become naturalized. So I'm just trying to disclose the historical process under which the imagination becomes dominated by this kind of schizophrenia. We are still together, Mos. We're okay. All right. Now I'm lost. All right. The Azanian approach to thinking and struggle, of course, spread beyond the confines of the PAC, both in time, that is, beyond the historical period of the PAC's greatest influence, and in space, that is, beyond the boundaries and identity of the party or movement itself. The Black consciousness movement of Azania, which gained ascendancy in the late 60s, was to adopt both the name Azania to describe the territory as well as the application of the theory of liberation developed first by the PAC, except for a few modifications. After the Black consciousness movement, the ideal of Azania was to be adopted by a variety of political organizations, including the Azanian People's Liberation Army, the Pan-Africanist Student Movement of Azania, the Azanian Political Organization, or AZAPO, the Socialist Party of Azania, or SOPA, the Azanian National Youth Unity, and so on and so on. The spread of the movement beyond the confines of the PAC's period of greatest influence was not restricted to the future, but in its interpretive guise extended also to the past. Although this talk will conclude with a a prolegomena to Azanian historiography, it's pertinent to make the point that one of the distinctive features of Azanian thought is precisely its historical orientation. At various points, whether amongst the Africanists of the Youth League, Mangaliso Sobukwe's PAC, or proponents of Black consciousness philosophy, the Azanians insisted that the struggle for liberation, understood as the restoration of sovereign title, predated the advent of European educated African intellectuals and their political parties and movements. Instead, they saw themselves and their movements as merely a contemporary iteration of an already thitherto multi-century war of resistance against colonial conquest. They counted the great kings and their warriors, figures such as the brother kings Shaka and Dingane Gasenza Ngakona, Ikumkani Uhinsa, Gakawuta, Khosi Sikukune, Khosi Mampuru, Khosi Moshweshwe, and the great warrior Inkosi Bambata as forebearers in their approach to the struggle for liberation. By Azanian critical philosophy, here, however, we mean to describe the contemporary theoretical and practical activity that has its foundation on the historical activities and thinking of the above political movements and the thinker-actors they produced. It includes a sustained study of the work of intellectuals, most of who were produced by these movements and who continue to write and practice even after 1994, some in the academy and others outside of it. Although these figures are not all academic philosophers, it is the principal underpinnings upon which their work is predicated that is instrumentalized and developed by Azanian critical theory, and which may be understood as a tendency in the discourse on post-colonial African philosophy. I think we can jump past this section and just deal with an elaboration of some of the concepts which appear even until now. I'm elaborating after already introducing these in my introduction. But we are still all good, right? Okay. So I must first make the point that it is our starting point that South Africa is the ultimate philosophical problem for the indigenous peoples conquered in the unjust wars of colonization. It's a problem with ethical, legal, political, epistemological, and even metaphysical implications. My focus here will be on the problem of historical knowledge, but in a rather interconnected fashion. Now, you may have heard me use the formulation indigenous peoples conquered in the unjust wars of colonization, and wondering to yourself why I keep on repeating this mantra. In fact, I think there's somebody who gave a presentation in this series last year who spent some time speculating. I don't know what it was called, but a kind of uncritical recitation. I assure you it's a rather critical recitation. If you examine the work, you'll notice in the examination, for instance, of the work of Sobukwe, that in his theory of race, which we'll put in inverted commas, Sobukwe neither invokes pigmentocracy nor biology, except to repudiate it as nonsense. In his distinction between the populations of South Africa, he produces what we might call a political ontology, in which the being of races derives itself from the quality of title to territory of the population so described. So Sobukwe defines whites as conquerors and usurpers. Whites derive their identity through the historical process of conquest. So whiteness is identified as having its origins and foundations in South African history in the usurpation, in the conquest of the title to territory. This is what in fact, I'm saying white, but he says European. In the language of the PAC, there are no whites but Europeans. And Europeans are the people of Europe who happen to have been here for some time, but are here as a result not of immigration but conquest. So there is a conceptual distinction. An immigrant is a person who comes to the place to become part of the place. He often is forced by the very dynamic of his immigration to learn the language of the people in that place, to learn about their cultural ways. And an immigrant generally within a few generations has already become part of the people of the place. Whites were so few in their number at the time of arrival that if they had been immigrants, I would suggest that whites would simply no longer exist. It is only through the process of conquest and the deliberate exclusionary practice of domination and the objectification of the indigenous people that we can speak about whites today. So whites, conquerors, not immigrants. So the point of the perpetual reference to conquest is a drawback to this question of Sobukwe. If we use the language of Dingan, we'd maybe speak of witches or abatagat, you know. But Sobukwe refers to this, he understands conquest as an integral part of the identity of Europeans in South Africa, okay? So, and of course, Africans then refer wholesale to the people of the land, a deviation from the Population Registration Act's dubious distinctions between African people, and an insistence on the synthetic whole historical unity of the African people, who at various times are divided by their conquerors for their ends, but Africans are those from whom this title to territory has been usurped, the conquered people. Okay, so now the language of just war, so the formulation is indigenous peoples conquered in the unjust wars of colonization, is a reference which will take us precisely to this. So, you know, if you look at the Oxford Dictionary of Concise English, the concise version, it defines conquest as the subjugation and assumption of control of a place or people by military force. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes, more specifically in his Leviathan, makes the conceptual distinction between conquest on the one hand and simple victory in war. So conquest is not simply to beat someone in war, all right? It's an acquisitive technology in terms of which that defeat is used as a justification of the assumption of title to territory. Hobbes writes as follows: conquest is not victory itself, but the acquisition by victory of a right over the persons of men. He, therefore, that is slain is overcome, but not conquered. He that is taken and put into prison or chains is not conquered, but he that upon the promise of obedience hath his life and liberty allowed him is then conquered and a subject and not before. Okay? So, you know, it's not just Hobbes. You can go to Pretoria, you can go to John Locke. The problem of conquest shows up in a number of political philosophers' work around the time of Europe's beginnings of the conquest of the New World, okay? And the point about conquest, I mean, the point is exactly about whether one can acquire a territory in a legal fashion from somebody else through this process. I mean, so Hobbes actually euphemistically describes this as conquest by consent. According to him, even slavery itself, Locke agrees, is founded on this relationship. So if you and me are fighting in a war, supposedly a just war, that means I have good cause to fight you because you've done something which is wrong. I fight you in this war. If I should defeat you in this war, I have the right to kill you because we are engaged in combat and we are in a time of war. If I should decide that I'm not going to kill you, your life is mine because I had the right to take it and decided not to. So this choice and your life now become mine, either to use as slave or, you know, and of course your property as well, what you had, is also mine. So Now I'm going to refer you to the words of the liberal historian Frida Troop, from the diaries of Van Riebeck, so you can see the relevance of this to our situation. Let us move now from Pretoria and Hobbes to the South African situation. The Khoi sued for peace and tried to regain rights to their pastures, standing upon it that we, the Dutch, had gradually been taking more and more of the land which had been there since the beginning of time, asking whether if they came to Holland, they would be permitted to do the like. The commander argued, Van Riebeck, that if their land were restored, there would not be enough grazing land for both nations. The Khoi replied, have we then no cause to prevent you from getting more cattle? The more you have, the more land you will occupy. And to say the land is not big enough for both, who should give way, the rightful owner or the invader? Van Riebeck made it clear that they had now lost their land in war, and therefore could only expect to be henceforth deprived of it. The country had thus fallen into our lot, being justly won in a defensive war, and it was our intention to retain it. All right? So, the main argument in my examination of South African history or historiography is that white historiography in South Africa rests upon the right of conquest. Its very foundation is the legitimation of this acquisitive technology of conquest. All right? So, we'll go through this very quickly. Typically, South African historiographers speak about three main trends. Of recent times, in the texts which have come out, I saw a paper by Saunders that came out very late last year, and another historian by the name of Merle Lipton wrote a book called Liberals, Marxists, and Nationalists, in which there's speech of an African nationalist historiography. But my contention is that this is dubious. Merle Lipton, in their assessment of sources that serve as example of this African nationalist historiography, refers to the newspaper and opinion pieces of Njabulo Ndebele and Xolela Mangu. Whereas, of course, in the assessment of the liberal, neo-Marxist, and Afrikaner nationalist school, it's the studying of an actual historical enterprise. So there is a tendency now to speak quite dubiously. I do believe there is an African historical tradition, but it certainly hasn't been studied by the authors who have been writing who've been writing historiography in the recent past. So typically, I'll just divide them into very broad camps. If there are historians amongst you, you might debate with me that we have the imperial school, and then we have the settler school, and then the Afrikaner nationalist school in the conservative camp. But I'll just speak of the conservatives at large, and they have their own definitions, but the conservatives are I would say they are the honest South African historical tradition is the conservative one. Biko very much famously teaches us to not be fooled by the supposedly ideological distinctions between white intellectual traditions. This is why I say white supremacy and whiteness are indissoluble. So the precise observation of Biko is that these improvisations are the attempts of obfuscating something which in itself is a unity. So the conservative school is the only tradition to assert explicitly that it is founded on the right of conquest. So if you look at people like George McCall Thiel in the settler English National School, or you look at someone like J.A. van Jaarsveld, there is an assertion. We took this land from barbarians. They tried to kill us. God helped us. We prevailed and butchered them. There's theological pretensions that, in fact, this is a land provided by God for us to save us from the tyranny of Louis XIV, amongst the Huguenots. So there are some theological pretensions and other metaphysics which are brought to provide a justification. But the conservative school unapologetically asserts that we have a right to this land as a greater civilization of Christian people who were given this land by our God. There were savages who were staying here, we defeated them, and we've got this now, you know. And when the Groot Trek starts, if you examine some of those constitutions, they don't make a secret of it, of the ontological difference between the conqueror and the conquered. In fact, conquest itself is seen as the will of God. If God really wanted you to win, you would have won. The very fact that we were able to defeat you suggests that God is on our side, and therefore what we are doing is ethically sound, you see. So there are references to this in some of the texts. But the conservatives, I don't spend much time on. Many white liberals are often concerned, why does black consciousness focus on good white people? We are trying to help you, but you expend this criticism on us when these conservatives are saying quite explicitly that you don't have a right to live, you know. Well, it's precisely because, the black consciousness tradition suggests that these distinctions themselves are questionable. In fact, what you have are just variations. And this is much more confusing because the ultimate result of the confusion is the assertion, the situation, the economic and political situation produced by our good friends, the liberals. Brother Eddie Maluka wrote a book recently, which was ignored mostly by the historical fraternity, called Friends of the Natives, an inconvenient history of South African liberalism. If you have some time, it would be good to examine just the record of friendship between us. In any case, the point is that the liberals then, of course, come in as good Christians and humanists to save the native in history from these abhorrent writings by the conservatives. First, we must understand, of course, history is not simply the attempt of the production of an account of what has happened. It serves also at an ideological level the purpose of a justificatory ground for how we get to this situation. History is a mode of ethical and cultural justification for the prevailing situation. Even in law, the historical dimension of any case is essential in establishing what is the problem. So history is the attempt at providing an account, very often produced by a political actor who is not himself or herself operating out of history, but belongs to a political community which enlists the historian to go and provide justificatory grounds for the historian's own position and the position of the historian's people in society. And that's why even in the discussion of South African historiography, we could very well turn it into a discussion of South African ideology. Or if we were still in the old days of the Bureau of Racial Affairs here, of national, so very much the historians, and unfortunately, there's very little that runs counter to this, come from political communities and produce accounts in the justification of their own population's interests in the country. In South Africa, especially with regards to title to territory, the students of Conquest make the point that although it is military by nature, in order to last and be successful, it has to convert itself into a legitimate title to territory. And it does that in one way through history and another through law. So the conqueror very often begins to write himself out of the conquest. This we begin to see happening with the liberals, who, we can study their political tradition, account for the Afrikaner as a barbarian, who is terrible to the natives because the Afrikaner left the enlightening force of the Cape liberal, the Cape and its liberal force, and left, and by becoming isolated from the enlightenment which the liberals were providing, fighting for the rights of natives, fell into a darkness and racial hatred, which accounts for all this barbarism of the Boer. But the liberal is the great friend of the native who wants him, if he's civilized, to be able to vote, to be able to participate in the life of the colony, as long as he abides with the law and custom of the liberal and accepts Western civilization. This is the nature of the friendship. In any case, so in the liberal version of history, you find the movement away from the justification of conquest itself, more to the focus on it speaks of itself as an inclusion of the native into history. You find many historians of history, who suggest that South African history was hitherto a history of Europeans in Africa. So the great accomplishment of the liberal historians is to include the natives in history, as they included the natives in politics, on the conditions that the native fulfill this and that condition. The ethos which underpins the liberal paradigm might be, equal rights for all civilized men. Of course, the point is that civilization for the white is natural. The white is born civilized and so already has these rights. The native, has to undergo a process of transformation and then be measured, and if he should be found to fit civilization, then can be included both in terms of the demands of political justice and history. Then, of course, you get the third. Many historiographers describe the liberal conservative jibe as the Anglo-Boer War by historiographical means. At a national level, it's just a fight of white people about who is a savage and who has a greater civilization and the plan to the future of South Africa. Then you have the neo-Marxist historiography, which enters into a contention. I suppose in simplistic terms we could call the ethos. So if the conservative ethos, the underpinnings of the conservative history are that history is the history of the civilized, and the civilized are white. The history is the history of conquerors. These ones say history is for civilized men. So some may be accepted into the realm of history if they fulfill the conditions which are set. The neo-Marxist paradigm could be characterized by South Africa belongs to all who live in it. History is for all of us, So, of course, as I'm saying, these paradigms do correspond to political movements in the country. The conservatives have a political tradition. They have I've 10 minutes. Okay, I'm going to try to close up. In any case, so the point is that the neo-Marxists then produce a critique of the liberal paradigm and its attempts, that it still has largely racist grounds. It conceives of the problem in individualistic terms. It believes that apartheid itself is actually antithetical to capitalism, rather than the fact that apartheid is in fact a result of and thrives from the unfoldment of capitalism. So these ones say, no, this thing will come to an end through a revolution that will bring socialism. These ones say, no, actually the market is going to bring an end to this. Well, Merle Lipton's book was a liberal boast to the Marxists that, we were actually right. South Africa got a liberal constitution, and in fact, things have gone as we had said. It's interesting that many of the Marxists, I don't know if you can find Marxists today, except at the university, who read Marx, but the actual personal lives of the Marxists or neo-Marxists is that they've become liberals or conservatives. They've either joined the DA, a la Belinda Bozzoli, etc., or they've gone even on the other flank. You can, so it's a very interesting factor. But the very examination of Marxist metaphysics itself suggests that in fact, the final point which I was going to try to make is that despite these supposed differences, it appears that Biko's observation, his preemptory observation, is correct, that all of these paradigms rest, whether it's South Africa belongs to all who live in it, equal rights for civilized men, rest on the right of conquest and the lack of problematization of the foundation of the title to territory. In fact, the subject of this was supposed to be to show that apartheid itself is just an iteration of these wars between white intellectuals. But apartheid is an obfuscation of the problem of conquest which subsists throughout South African history. And that apartheid, if taken too seriously by social scientists, stands to obfuscate the nature of our historical reality and our ability to examine that reality. That apartheid itself is just a juridical specification of a process which predates whatever is called apartheid from 1948 and supposedly is concluded in 1994. That there's nothing exceptional about this period at all. It's just a particular political community of whites arranging their conquest, their right of conquest in a particular way. But that everything which apartheid is accorded with having originated, it didn't. Whether it's segregation, whether, you can, the examination of apartheid in comparative terms suggests that there's nothing which is special about apartheid. And the privileging of apartheid as a historiographical category in the interpretation of South Africa causes us to ignore the fact of the unity of South African history and causes us to expect that we are treating a new time. But what I'm suggesting is that we are still in the time of conquest. So we should not be surprised about the continuity of the problems, whether they are from before apartheid, during apartheid, or after apartheid, that in the overall structure, the problem remains the same. So, and the problem I'm suggesting is the question of conquest and of title to territory. I hope we'll be able to elaborate through our Q&A. Thank you very much.
Wow, thanks so much for that. I'm sure we could have let you carry on, but it might be more interesting to continue. I thought I'd just start off by, what really fascinated me were these three main themes, or at least something I thought, right, is about this question of silences, and I'm also linking to last week, this, who do we listen to, but also who do we read, right? And silence, I think Anjali told us last week, that silence are actions, right? They also do something, they're not just simply, omissions, and so by reading silences, we get to see what kinds of positions, what kinds of critical engagements are critically engaged with, and which kinds of them are dismissed as completely, useless. And I think that that's incredibly valuable at the current moment. Anthropology is long concerned with categorization, and I see that you really have taken this up, right? How does anthropologists themselves, or the humanities themselves, produce categorizations which perhaps are not helpful, which create other kinds of, so we know from the critical study of categories, right, that it's always power-laden, and we can actually study them, and I think that you've done that very interestingly in the sense taking on like revisionist histories, which tend to create past difference in a kind of a, what do they call it, like kind of a pacifying move, as if, to paralyze critique or to paralyze the position. And finally, thank you for introducing us to the critiques of liberalism, right? Which obviously are in South Africa, are growing, and I think I definitely will read the book you mentioned, already published in 2014, which I think is a brilliant example, right, of a kinds of silencing. So this is a book that's been around for many years, but we are not discussing it in our debate. Okay, so hopefully you've had time to now send your questions. Okay, Simone, anybody can just...
Yes, let me first say I came back to this department 15 to 20 years ago, and your voice is the second time at the University of Stellenbosch that I've heard a clear, formal placing in front of us of what I call the Azanian Historical Discourse. The other one was Manku's voice from UCT. And I think it really is important, I'm talking about Stellenbosch in this, to hear what is a very important paradigm. And I would also like to say that I was a student here in the 1960s. There were a few of us aware of Biko and Black consciousness, and since then, clearly, in my knowledge, your voice has been marginalized. So it is both important today and it is clearly been marginalized. I mean, that's the first thing I'd like to say. It really is important for Stellenbosch, for this department, and for the country. I have a question. My question is, Kader Asmal, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, under the Mandela and then the Mbeki governments, was asked to establish the South African History Project. It was headed up by a former doctoral student from this department, whose name is June Bam, and that South African History Project was supposed to write a new history for the new South Africa, particularly for school children and for the public at large. And it was also supposed to try and make certain that the evils of the past, I quote, the evils of the past should not be repeated in the future. Now, my question, first of all, is would you agree that that should be an aim of a history for South Africans? And my second question is, since that time, there have been 3 or 4 debates I've been at where this request by the government has been discussed, and 2 groups are formed. The one group says we should not have a single history, a single paradigm, a single narrative for our school children. We should have the liberal, the conservative, the Marxist, and the Azanian. And these kids, our kids, South African kids, should be able to see the different histories and, as it were, make up their own minds. The other side says, and I'm certain you know of this, the other side says there needs to be one narrative. There needs to be one story which everyone is taught and everyone goes along with. There ought to be one master narrative. That's my second question. Where would you fall in terms of that choice?
Right. Okay. So I can. It's an elaborate question. I think I answer it directly first. So you know the problem is a problem which regards power, and the problem is that even as we speak about the government, the paradigm which wins in a paper which I recently published, which is supposed to be the liberation of South African history. I try to make the point about the historical foundations that the Constitution itself, the 108 of 1996, has its basis in a particular interpretation of South African history, which is predominant, you know. And I mean, one of the observations of the Azanian tradition was actually the claim that the ANC after 1955 had left the ranks of the liberation movement. And so, and this is back to the question of civil rights that versus national liberation, which I didn't elaborate extensively. But the problem for me is the question of power. So for instance, you had the South African Democratic Education Trust, SADET, which under the editorship, among others, of the late Professor Bernard Makubane, produced the Road to Democracy project, the 7-volume history of South African politics. Of course, the Road to Democracy promises to be a multi-perspective historical account which takes into account the voices of all these competing traditions. The interesting thing is that the very title of the project itself, The Road to Democracy, already contains a teleological conception of South African political history as the road to democracy. Of course, this is a very particular interpretation. In South African history, the idea that the founding antagonism is that blacks are not allowed to participate in the political goings-on, and liberation is the attainment of democracy. It's something which belongs to the liberal tradition taken up by the ANC very early on. So even as this pretends to be an overarching historical account which takes account of these voices, its synthesis under Makubane himself, a former an ANC stalwart, with money provided by Thabo Mbeki, still produces an ANC history, of the country. But my philosophical inclination would be that precisely because of my suspicion of power and the way in which it would produce this account, we would need to be able to have a historiographical dimension which studies the dynamics of ideology in the construction of history, so that people are taught that there are always competing historical interpretations as they are taught accounts of the past, and that they produce, different accounts of history. But it would depend on under whose regime this was offered, what it would look like, because you can still have a pretension to multi-perspectivality, which nevertheless is really, everyone else appears as a straw man in order for the Congress to emerge. So this is something which I'm suspicious of, but it's what we have at this point in time that I would recommend. I wouldn't trust anyone right now to produce, except for myself, of course, to produce one unified historical account. And so failing to write it myself and prescribe it for all the schools, I think the history should be promoted as a controversy, that historical interpretation is not a pure scientific activity, but corresponds to human interests, and to study those human interests in relation to the interpretations which they provide of the same events.
Thank you. The back? Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for those. I don't know, maybe I didn't get it, but when you were explaining your use of the mantra, the indigenous conquered people through unjust laws, you went through explaining why, first of all, you call it indigenous, tied to territory, you move on, talk about why they were conquered, they explained conquest. But what I didn't get was, why would you say then that the conquest was unjust? Because you can still say that we were conquered people. Then the conservative account of why South Africa is the current state will still stand, because we're conquered through just wars. Therefore, and in the definition of being conquered, we deserve to be in the place we're in.
Right.
So I had to go, maybe I didn't get it, I don't know if you did, but why would you then go on to say that through unjust though? Why would you say
Right.
unjust? Yeah.
Right. Well, firstly, it's to point that, in fact, it is not the conquest that I describe as unjust, but the war which leads to the conquest. So conquest itself is neither just nor unjust, but war. So this takes us back to the doctrines of Thomas Aquinas, for instance. So, the point is that, you have what they call ius in bellum, the justice in war, and so in the conduct of war itself, and the justice of the war itself. So there are grounds which would be considered justifiable for the two of us to enter into combat, and I can be assumed to be justified for entering into combat. But then when being in combat, there are also problems related to what is just conduct during the This doesn't answer your question, because, of course, if you look at the history of the philosophical writings on conquest, amongst the reasons which have been provided are that if you are dealing with barbarians, the conquest, the war is always just, because it's a war of proselytization. In fact, even Marx is an interesting proponent of conquest, this time not for Jesus, but for communism. So Marx believes that the societies outside, that the European bourgeoisie has a responsibility. In the conquest of these societies, these people must attain maturity in order to be able to then attain communism. So the conquest, in fact, is good for the conquered. So you get that in the Christian tradition, and a lot of these wars were wars of Christianization. That was, but you also get secular justifications, which say it's a war for commerce, and of course, in the kind of historical apparatus, you get claims that there was no one there. This is a popular one in the African nationalist paradigm, that actually there was no war because there was no one there. Or two, we arrived here at the same time. And so, it's a question of discovery. We found it first, it's ours, You find us, keep us. So you get these accounts. But my insisting that it's unjust is on the basis of the Azanian interpretation, that it was unprovoked, it was unprovoked, and that we are not talking about immigrants. You can read, the historical accounts, for instance, of Mazizi Gunene about the arrival of the English. Even Jordan Kush Ngubaneze, an African Explains Apartheid, has records of white immigrants, like the Dans and the Finns, who came to the Zulu and said, listen, we would like some land, can we stay here? And were actually absorbed into those communities, produced children. In fact, I work at the university in the psychology department. There's a fellow I work with whose surname is Finn, who is descended from a Scottish immigrant named Finn. So very clearly, the peoples of the land had been admitting people who had immigrated over long spells of time. But this is a decisively different relation, And the second thing is that you've got wars which have happened, but if you begin from an ontological difference, a hierarchical difference in the conqueror and conquered, one of the things that is prevented, many European conquests have been erased simply by the synthesis of conqueror and conquered. So the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons simply become a single population, and as a result of that, it is no longer possible to make the distinction between conqueror and conquered because they are the same people. But here, because of the racist foundations of the conquest, the justification is not simply we'd like to use your land and this, but that you yourself are defective as a human being and must be kept separate and enslaved by the conqueror, which produces a history of this differentiation. So in fact, so it subsists. And it's interesting because even according to the Western philosophers, John Locke in his second treatise on politics, for instance, such as, much like we do, ukuthi cala alboli. In the Bantu languages, the point is that extinctive prescription does not apply. An injury cannot graduate into a right through the passage of time. And so Locke asserts that if the title was acquired by conquest, the conquered, whenever he has the might to resist, whether 100 years may pass, a million years, has the right to undo this problem which prevails. So it is from that background of interpretation that, I certainly don't think that the use of this force was justified. But you're right, it is an interpretation. Van Jaarsveld would say, you were barbarians, you didn't know Christ, and you needed to be dealt with. So there are accounts which say it is conquest, but it is just. I'm contending with that.
Sure, Brandos. I didn't imagine that the last time when we saw each other we would meet here at the home of African so easy. Anyway, my question will be on your charge around the question of positionalism in different texts that you write about how 1994 or the 1960 Constitution was an extension of the 1939 Act, which you also pick up from the 1955 Freedom Charter, which says that the land belongs to all the individuals. And from a philosophical perspective, as you have put, from the Azanian school of thought, so like there are people who claim that today that the Constitution of our country emanates from various struggles from the African people who were fighting in terms of law, which is an argument put forward by Tayob in his latest book. And also, how does that differ with the Azanian school of thought and the continuation of the erasure of the Azanian way of thinking or the philosophical outlook of the Azanian school of thought?
Right. Yeah. So the basic argument which I've been trying to make in these texts is that One, the South African Constitution in its founding clauses makes the claim to be founded on the value of non-racialism, amongst others. You know, it says that it's founded, it declares itself to be founded on non-racialism. The same South African Constitution in its section 25 contains a property clause which fundamentalizes the right to property. Now the point is that if we are talking about a period of conquest in which the acquisition of title has happened precisely in a racially differentiated way, in which people, we have records that no historian can deny, have land and property and life taken precisely on the basis of race. It is not possible to declare races over while that state of affairs prevails, and in fact then convert the law to protect the very state of affairs. So if you like, the Constitution becomes precisely racist because the Constitution, recognizing the injustices of our past, as it says, nevertheless decides to resolve them by protecting those injustices of the past, by converting them into fundamental rights. This is something which is quite curious. Of course, we know that, Albie Sachs has admitted to his poetic musings and writings in the Constitution, much like Rusty Bernstein's own confessions regarding the Freedom Charter. From an epistemological point of view, the Constitution is no African constitution. And one of the curious things which we also bring into question is the fact that South Africa had many constitutions. This one was not the first one, with the Boer republics had constitutions, the 1910, the 1961 Republican Constitution, the 1983 tricameral Constitution. But out of all these constitutions, the present constitution is the first constitution to have supremacy over, to be supreme, to be the supreme law. Before this time, Parliament was supreme. During the time of Apartheid, when there were no popular numbers, it was Parliament that was supreme and could make laws on the will of the people. But if you look at de Klerk's referendum with the white community in 1992, he makes them assurances that if you authorize me to negotiate with these guys, I promise you that nothing will change, specifically mentioning the question of property, And so the guarantee, he's able to provide that guarantee through ensuring the supremacy of the Constitution, which means that no matter how many of you agree, there is a clever person who has negotiated undemocratically and not agreed to through a popular consultation. They took this out of the 1993 interim constitution. One of the non-negotiable aspects of the interim constitution was that there were founding clauses which were non-negotiable, and it was to be supreme. So if I had a few people in the country who needed a lot of power to do things, and I could get some people to agree to allow us to rule through a system, even regardless of whether we had the numbers or popular will. It's a great idea. De Klerk must be really considered to be a serious Afrikaner hero for what he has accomplished. But unfortunately for us, there's something which is deeply suspicious and wrong about this, because what we have is a juristocracy, in which if the popular will of people doesn't accord with certain demands of other people who are not popular, it can simply be struck down or declared unconstitutional. So, this is the point. Then, of course, the constitutions, the constitutional orders, hierarchization of the sources of law in South Africa means that African law, which is called by the derogation a customary law, is actually the lowest source of law. The law of the people of the land is considered such a low source of law that it can be overturned even by the lowest of the European courts. So it's like a chess rule. Law, in order to be law, must have force. But what they call African customary law, if you don't like it, you go to the magistrate's court, and it is not binding. It is for those who wish to be bound by it, and that is no law. So, I mean, even the claim that this is our constitution becomes quite dubious when one considers the very juridical architecture of South Africa, No more questions?
Not yet. I want to ask you, I want to take the opportunity.
Okay.
Seeing that you identify these problems which you identify, which you so brilliantly place out, I think are actually not quite strange elsewhere. Right? So having done my own training in South Asian studies, there's a lot of critique, right, about how the colonial law, how the liberal constitution, what kinds of, basically, different regimes of law. But of course, the differences are interesting, right? So in a place like India, already in the 19th century, there's a huge fight by local doctors, for example, right, to basically claim themselves as a medical tradition in front of the colonial law. And it goes on, I don't know if the dates now confuse my history, but by the early 20th century, they had already been established. Until today, where you have universities for other systems of medicine, for example, and things like that. So I completely see where you're going. I mean, there's a lot of similarities. But the problem is, I'm wondering about the redemptive narrative of your, the element of redemption, which is also there, So as much as there's a critique of Christian theological underpinnings in historiography and conquest and all these kind of things, I get the sense that there's a kind of an idea as which, for example, there can be there's a possibility for redemption, which is kind of inversion.
Right.
Going back to maybe this moment of conquest, because if the moment was the origin, and maybe a revival of, say, African law, etc., etc. But other scholars have argued that this is completely untenable. Right? So constitutionalism, by its very nature, actually rejects other forms of, say, knowing, or So my question, I guess, for you is when you use the language of the liberal constitutionalism, right, of law, of justice, and a kind of a redemption, and yet ask for the redemption, how do you see this actually playing out? Like, what kind of political, legal, constitutional reality is to follow?
Right.
When scholars have argued that there are inherent tensions in the way, for example, that liberalism has constituted itself as an incredibly supremely Western kind of, supreme rational order, which overrides other cultures around the world, right? Cultural, religious forms of, and conquest being one of them, but also the right to,
Right. Well, I think I understand underneath all what you're saying. At most conferences where it isn't academics, the activists simply say, so what are we going to do? Yeah. I think this is what you are asking. What is to be done?
No, I'm not asking what is to be done in a very formal way. I'm wondering how, I guess, are these tensions resolvable?
Right.
This is the question.
Right.
Because these tensions have, obviously, historians, anthropologists, philosophers have brought them out, right?
Right.
The liberal constitutionalism is not neutral. It is a particular kind of, like you say, it protects private property, it abolishes, it produces amnesia about past conquest, it presents us all as somehow equal before the law, magically we all arrived.
Right.
Whereas there are other conceptions, of course, right, which you allude to. I think other historical traditions, you allude to other cultural, religious, whatever, sources, memories.
Right.
So in that sense, I guess,
so
I'm trying to understand, are these tensions resolvable?
Okay, all right.
Or are we talking about an abolition? Is there...
Right, no, I mean, you see in my work I do talk about abolition. My sense is that we need to abolish this constitution. The only resolution which we have, there's two basic options. It will either be war or it will be the end of the constitution. This is not the language of alarm. It is necessary to understand that despite the pronouncements of the miracle of South Africa's negotiations having averted war, this is incorrect. The war was not averted. I would say to you, South Africa is in a state of war. if you examine the numbers of many of the bodies that keep track of wars, South Africa has the highest rate of murder in a place outside of war, the highest rate of rape in a place outside of war. The statistics for violent death in South Africa are usually provided with a parenthetical undertaking in a place outside of war. But the mistake is precisely that we do have a war. It's just what happened. Instead of the war being between the conqueror and the conquered, there was a very clever play of internalizing the violence amongst the historical victims of that very violence. So the violence has actually been stored in the townships away from the beneficiaries of that violence historically. So despite the claim that war has been averted, I'm saying that it hasn't been. If you read South African history from this point of view, conquest is always caught in a paradoxical problem of its own legitimation. If it agrees that it is conquest, it means it has no ethical foundations because it's force rather than the will of people. So it always has to assert itself. People, so long as they remember that the conquest exists, always stand to fight against the conquest. And so we've had numerous historical episodes from the earliest wars of colonization. We've had the Bambata Revolt, which is then put out, and conquerors typically cut the heads off of whoever leads the uprising, puts them on pikes in order to scare people into acquiescing to an unjust situation. But then you have the Sharpeville massacre, which is impossible, which is difficult for many historians to explain why it is that the Boers respond with such force to people simply saying that they've had enough. The recognition which had been made by Sobukwe, you see that there was a recent controversy now about Sobukwe about Sobukwe having had a nice time in prison. That was given by one of the members of the civil rights organization called the South African Communist Party. Yes, not recognizing precisely why Sobukwe was a different species of prisoner than Mandela. Mandela was a criminal, if you like, in the technical demands of the law. Sobukwe was not imprisoned by a court but by parliament. And this is a very important distinction to make. He had technically not broken the law, and in fact, when required to plead in court, actually questioned the right of conquest by saying, in fact, your law has no foundation. It has no foundation in the populace because it has not been authorized by the people of this land. It has no historical foundation, so I don't have to plead. So it was Parliament that had to take the resolution that this guy must be imprisoned. And if you look, Elias Ndwedibe has a book called Here is a Tree, which was written in the early 90s. It has an addendum at the end where Helen Suzman is asking the government, why is this guy in prison? Why have you, of everyone in this country, decided to make a law to put this guy in prison? And they really do not provide any kind of sound answer to this question. But what had happened is that Sobukwe had recognized that even war wasn't necessary. The very white system itself depended so heavily on black people, as Hobbes says, acquiescing, consenting to the conquest, that they simply needed to stop. And if they simply stopped, then the system was over. He hypothesized that the economy will be dead within 24 hours if they imprison everyone who takes this call up. And in the panic of recognizing this, the ANC had been in existence since 1912 without the Boers banning the ANC or banning any liberation movements. The PAC was in existence for less than a year. On its first motion, the entire liberation movement was declared, unlawful. So it's precisely this, the intellectual recognition of the foundations of conquest and the possibility of their repudiation without even much fanfare or drama, which caused these guys to take tanks kill people, and topple the country into a state of crisis, you know. So this still remains to be the case. The constitution is just a successor in title to the administration of conquest. And through the education system and the stories that we are told on television, South Africans keep on repeating we have the best constitution in the world and believe that they are responsible for it. But it's just a successor in the kinds of games that the conqueror has been playing. So the two things that will happen is either you'll listen to what I say, and we abolish this thing and actually produce a proper constitution. The second thing that will happen is that the war which has been averted will move from where it has been contained at present to the place where it actually belongs. You know, this will require some work, but it is already the level of consciousness amongst the people has changed. Yesterday, while working at the cafe, I found a sister who felt she could speak to me while I was working and told me about gross humiliation she had suffered at the hands of one of the restaurateurs in Stellenbosch. Just gave me scary details of the ways in which the town works. I just listened as she told me, and I said to her, shit, I don't know, you know, I'm frustrated by the fact that I don't know what to offer you. All my clever things were irrelevant at the moment. She was shivering. She was shivering at the humiliation she had suffered. Oh, she's a graduate of this university, by the way, like many of these waitresses in this town who works for 20 Rand an hour. She was telling me this shit. I said to her, okay, what do you think is to be done? And you know, she went straight to the answer that we need to take our land back. That was the answer. Without too much elaboration, she understood the very foundations of the violence and humiliation that people continue to suffer, just in the services that they perform, which become a necessity for them within this structure. She understood that to be founded itself in the question of title to territory. So this was not popular consciousness 10 years ago, but it is popular consciousness presently. So I do think that either we're going to repudiate this order or it's going to be forced, you know, and of course, when it comes by force, we can't predict what the outcomes will be, but I don't think that this is going to be sustainable for much longer. Are you taking notes, Shaheed?
Always. I don't know why. Can always watch it later. I'm sure we will. Oh, sorry, Bernard.
Thank you for a very stimulating presentation. I have two sorts of questions. The one is, you know, when you're referring to the kind of some of the philosophical kind of foundations of some of the thought, you refer a lot to Hobbes and also to Whiteness. And and of course your argument is also about the continuity between early conquest in South Africa and the present. And I'm kind of wanting to kind of push you on that. I mean, on one hand, of course, there's this question of modernity and where it features in your work. I mean, are we the same, you know, as that period, and how do we encounter and how do we deal with the specific problem of modernity? On the other hand, if one thinks through something like Foucault, you know, the idea is that governance is a much more complex management of society than it might have been previously. And he has this very neat formulation around that in the past the state killed or let live, and now it gives life or lets die, right? In other words, it becomes a sort of biological state. So I'm kind of wondering about that. And then the second set of questions are really around the question of the global. The historical traditions that you explain, and I think I agree with you that they're all caught in whiteness, right? But I wonder the extent to which they're also bound by the fact of their inward-lookingness. You know, this had multiple factors, claims about South African exceptionalism, you know, isolation in various fronts, anti-intellectualism. You know, there were lots of reasons for this. But I'm wondering now, if we think about the question of the global, how the question of the global might feed into your rereading of Azanian historiography. What is it that makes regional similarity important? Moving across national borders. National borders, of course, defined by conquest. What about particularly global resonances between things happening in Europe, in the United States, etc., in Latin America, and yeah. So those are the two sets of questions.
Okay, I think the last set of questions are the ones I'll address first, because I think the earlier questions I need to ask my own questions first before I'm able to answer you. But I mean, the question, I mean, in Western political theory, I mean, since the Greeks, one of the fundamental problems is the one of contradiction. Aristotle has on causes of revolution, and the problem, I mean, is that if you have a polity over a period of time, with certain aspects of it not dealt with, poverty being one of them, the distribution of resources, it leads to revolution by necessity. And what revolution does is that it destroys the historical continuity of the state, of its ability to produce this universal progress, which, the philosophy of history, idealist philosophy of history, is obsessed with. And, Europe had a number of these revolts and the destruction of historical process, over and over again. But the discovery of the new world, I mean, was the ability to externalize these contradictions. So the problem was that, as things are getting nice, you need some bastards in your own population to work for you, in order for you to live this nice life. But then eventually those bastards become tired and they revolt against you and destroy everything that you claim you've built on the back of their work. But now you've found a new world, you've found literally a new world where you can take all these bastards that were going to be causing you these problems so that they become a problem in another place. And in fact, they may be a problem for those people, but they themselves are able to attain the status of the noblemen of your own locale for the first time through by producing their own subjects, So, I mean, the invention of whiteness, and the question of conquest in this becomes the ability, then Europe is able to have an undisturbed period of progress for that period from the late 1400s without a major toppling, So, I mean, and Julie focuses more on settler colonial studies than I do, but the comparative study of New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the United States, and the kinds of logics in which this externalization of European contradictions takes on in the conquest of the New World. I think if you have genocide, it may very well be simpler, the logic of elimination. You get rid of the conquered people, there is no future of justice for you to worry about. Of course, you re-establish the problems of Europe because your slaves have to come from your own stock that you conquered with, So, you just make a new Europe. But the point was, here, don't eliminate them, we can put them to work. And it's precisely the persistence of that situation. So the Marxists tell us that actually it's just a classical case of class exploitation. But, I mean, there are objections to this because the exploited populations are a stock which are chosen on very systematic grounds, So, I mean, as I see it, these problems are, I mean, the stock has now returned to Europe. The interesting thing which is happening now is that there's all these upheavals which are happening in Europe because all of these people that they've been doing this to are immigrating. And, the climate of fear between classes or peoples is emerging in a way that had been dealt with some time ago, So it's interesting that these questions have almost begun to take different forms all over the world. I mean, the paradigm of settler colonial studies in the United States, you have a different account of what happens if it's a slave population that is transported and the indigenous people are eliminated. You know, you have, so I mean, I'm not sure how it answers your question, but the complication of the globalized nature of the system is the fact that, of course, the resolution of South African problems is quite difficult and impossible without taking into account the implication of that resolution for the global interests which have their hands in South Africa at present. And I mean, I think Trump's own interest in South Africa's affairs, it should give us a sign. There's a rise of even AfriForum knew to go to Flemish-speaking people, to the United States, to Australia, in order to really support, because of recognizing that the question of title to territory that they have here, they share with other whites who were exported to these places. And because the South African developments have implications for all these whites who were exported to these places, our resolution will set an international precedent. And so there's all kinds of support which recognizes this situation really, you know, and the taking up of old discredited Africanist historiography, that has suddenly come up. I mean, those debates were resolved in the 1980s by Aboshula Marx already, but they've now returned. They've returned the coterminous arrival hypothesis, terra nullius hypothesis, the very strange transmutation of the so-called colored population into indigenous. So the point of this hypothesis is that, of course, the Bantu languages in this country are the only instance throughout the continent of Bantu languages which contain the 3 cliques, all right? And it's precisely because of the long period of interrelations between, people who came at different points in time in their country, and there's been well-established historical work. In any case, the Xhosa people lived in the closest proximity for the largest period of time with the Ka and, in the eastern regions of the Cape. But by some strange trick now, only those indigenous people who had relations with whites are indigenous. If Khoisan people were with Xhosa people, they are no longer indigenous. They become, but if there is a white ancestor, suddenly you transmute into hyper-indigenous. But if so these things should not really be a logic that can defeat anyone who has attained the age of reason. A 12-year-old should be able to see the logic in this. But it has become popular discourse in the newspapers and taken up at an international level. So, I mean, the global, South Africa's situation itself, of course, we know was never possible. The Anglo, I mean, the Boer Zulu wars, the Boer Pedi wars happened through some white cooperation as far as the provision of arms. It's always been a global international white supremacist situation. The ability to build nuclear arms, the ability to trade. They would have never been able to accomplish this without the cooperation of the international community, which also managed the transition and the elevation of the constitution. So it is true. I mean, now we're speaking at a public level, but I do shudder to think what will happen when what must be done happens. And what I think will happen is that, as they say, South Africa will become an African country. They will unleash the chaos which we have been saved from in relation to our brothers and sisters on the rest of the continent because of the presence of their kinsfolk. They will unleash that. That means paid militia. That means unfettered war. Immediately, those interests are disturbed, and they offer. The Zimbabweans, the Rhodesians, were offered visas and passports within a few weeks, to repatriate. Once they repatriate, then we will rejoin the African continent in some ways. And this is something which needs to be conceived, which brings the Pan-Africanist dimension, that the rebellion and liberation of South Africa is not possible without the dealing with our dislocation from the rest of the continent and the continent itself, its own fragmentation. These things have to be dealt with contemporaneously and continuously. Otherwise, they are definitely going to screw us up, So, I doubt this is the way you conceive the answer to your question. But the global entanglements in the creation of this situation are in this way. And we share, much of the sources I draw from are Amerindian sources and Australian because the historical foundations of our situation is so similar that the comparativity has been natural, since the beginning, Yeah.
Oh, okay. Before I gave up, we would have not gave up. What do you call it? Decided to call it off because we've just gone over time. I think we could have carried on. I was happy to take a question. Everybody is listening to you, but we'll get you back again to continue the next paper. We can learn more. And also, thank you very much.
No, thank you.